I have a classmate who used to work as a driver at a crematorium in our hometown county. One particular experience was enough to leave an indelible mark on his life. It happened one night in July. My classmate had already gone to bed when, around 11 p.m., he suddenly received a call from the crematorium. They told him to go to a village near the county town to pick up a body. In the past, when someone died in the countryside, the body would typically be kept at home for 3 days, allowing relatives to mourn and say their goodbyes before burial. But after the funeral reform was implemented, bodies were generally sent to the crematorium for cremation. Nowadays, the deceased are taken to the crematorium on the same day, stored in a freezer, and then cremated on a date chosen by the family as auspicious. That night, it was already late, and the village was a bit far from the county town. My classmate reluctantly got out of bed and put on his clothes. Having worked at the crematorium for several years, his personality had transformed from timid and fearful to bold and carefree. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. Normally, picking up a body outside the county required at least 2 people, but when he called his colleague, the guy was suffering from an upset stomach. Feeling bad for him, my classmate decided to go alone and drove the hearse himself. The distance from the county town to the village was just over 10 kilometers. The route involved crossing a small dirt hill, passing through dense forests, and, worst of all, driving by an old, unmarked graveyard. It was said that this graveyard was the resting place of bandits killed before the liberation and nationalist paratroopers. My classmate had heard stories from others. Several drivers claimed to have seen ghosts there, and some even said it had caused accidents. Fortunately, the trip there went smoothly, and in less than 20 minutes, he arrived at the village where the death had occurred. As he approached the village entrance, he could faintly hear crying in the distance, mixed with the occasional crack of firecrackers and the sound of gongs and drums used to summon the soul. In the quiet night of this remote mountain village, these intermittent sounds felt eerie and unsettling. Following the noise, he easily found the deceased's home, a typical rural household. The dead man was a young guy, about 27 or 28 years old, unmarried, still living with his parents. That evening, around 8 p.m., he'd had an argument with his family and, in a fit of anger, drank 2 bottles of pesticide. Within 10 minutes, he was gone. From the look of it, his death had been excruciating. His face was severely twisted and deformed, and his stomach had burst open, creating a horrifying sight. At that moment, under the dim white light, he lay quietly in the courtyard on 2 makeshift wooden boards. His face was covered with a white sheet, and his feet were tied with hemp rope. According to rural superstition, if the feet weren't bound, a passing cat or rat could cause the corpse to reanimate. Since he'd died from drinking pesticide, it was considered a violent death in village lore. If the body wasn't removed quickly, his ghost might linger and bring harm to the villagers. As soon as my classmate arrived, the people busy with the funeral preparations crowded around him. The deceased's parents were honest, simple farmers. Losing their son was devastating, but under pressure from the villagers, they had no choice but to agree to have him taken away for cremation as soon as possible. My classmate was invited into the living room, where the father discreetly slipped a red envelope into his hand. Then, some of the helpers brought out food and drinks. While he ate, the men hurriedly loaded the body into the hearse. This had become a routine in rural funerals, and my classmate was used to it. He ate heartily, even downing a few cups of liquor. After finishing, he stepped outside to use the bathroom. By then, the helpers had all left, and the courtyard was eerily quiet. With a hearse carrying a corpse parked there, the air outside felt heavy and oppressive, almost chilling. After relieving himself, he casually walked to the vehicle to check if the body was properly loaded. As he opened the door, a voice suddenly came from inside. "Can we go now?" My classmate nearly jumped out of his skin. He stumbled back a few steps, steadied himself, and realized there was a man sitting in the hearse. "The family's either too old or too young," the man said with a smile, revealing a row of strikingly white teeth. "I'm the only one who can help send him to the crematorium." My classmate immediately felt relieved. He'd been dreading the lonely drive back, and now he had company. He considered going back inside to say goodbye to the family, but the man waved him off, saying, "Let's just go. No need to tell them." With no other choice, my classmate started the engine. As the hearse drove off, the deceased's parents rushed out of the house, shouting something loudly, but he couldn't make it out. He waved back and sped away. The hearse moved steadily along the empty rural road. Since it was carrying a body, it couldn't jostle too much, so he drove at about half the speed he'd come. After about 10 minutes, he turned to the man sitting behind him and asked, "So, what's your relation to the deceased?" The man hadn't said a word since getting in. "I'm his cousin," the man replied in a low, muffled voice. In the dim light, my classmate couldn't see his face clearly, just those gleaming white teeth. As the saying goes, if the conversation doesn't flow, even half a sentence feels like too much. Seeing that the man wasn't keen on talking, my classmate focused on driving. It made sense the guy's cousin had just died. He was probably grieving and not in the mood to chat. A little while later, a full moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting its bright glow over the rural landscape. The hearse was now passing through a forest, where moonlight filtered through the trees, leaving dappled shadows on the road. Though my classmate was pretty fearless, having a corpse in the back of the vehicle while driving through an empty countryside road at midnight started to give him an uneasy, chilling feeling. What made it worse was that the man behind him remained completely silent. He seemed to be asleep, but every time my classmate glanced back, intentionally or not, the man was sitting upright, staring ahead. And each time he smiled, those dazzling white teeth stood out. Finally, the hearse emerged from the forest, and the landscape opened up. My classmate's nerves began to ease. The moonlight grew even brighter, illuminating the hills, streams, and bushes along the road. But just then, his heart seized up again. His gaze had unintentionally drifted to the rearview mirror, and it showed nothing. The man was sitting right behind him. His reflection should have been visible. The air seemed to freeze. My classmate held his breath, too tense to even exhale. Sure, he'd heard ghost stories from colleagues before, but he'd never believed them. Not until tonight. Bracing himself against the overwhelming fear, he quickly turned his head and nearly cursed himself. The man had somehow switched seats to the other side without him noticing. He flashed that same smile, his white teeth gleaming faintly in the moonlight. A few minutes later, a dark cloud swallowed the moon, plunging the surroundings back into darkness. Everything became shadowy and indistinct, the midnight air thick with an ominous chill. Suddenly, the man spoke. "Got a cigarette? I could use one." "Yeah, sure," my classmate replied, grabbing a pack from the dashboard and handing it back. As he did, his hand brushed the man's, and a shiver ran through him. The man's hand was as cold as ice. The guy lit the cigarette and started puffing away, the red glow flickering in the dark cabin. But oddly, my classmate couldn't smell any smoke. "I swallowed all the smoke," the man said, as if sensing his confusion. My classmate forced a smile, but it quickly froze on his face. He watched in horror as the man lifted the shroud, pulled the corpse's head out of the bag, and stuck the cigarette in its mouth. A chill ran down his spine, and he nearly lost control of the steering wheel. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Doesn't bother your driving, does it?" the man said, sounding almost apologetic. "My cousin loved smoking when he was alive, so I'm letting him have a couple puffs." "Oh right," my classmate said, his heart settling slightly, though unease lingered. "Still, you should put him back. Don't disturb him anymore." "All right, just a couple more puffs," the man replied. He cradled the corpse's head in his arms, adjusting its twisted, grotesque face and manually opening and closing its stiff jaw. Slowly, faint wisps of smoke began curling from the dead man's mouth. My classmate's scalp tingled, his heart racing. "Stop messing around, or I'll make you get out," he finally shouted, unable to take it anymore. The man paused, then smiled again with those snowy white teeth. He stuffed the corpse back into the bag. My classmate let out a long, shaky breath. In all his years, he'd never met someone so bizarre or so unafraid of the dead. The hearse continued smoothly, crossing the small hill and passing the unmarked graveyard. When the suburban buildings came into view, the weight on my classmate's chest finally lifted. About a kilometer from the crematorium, the man said, "Stop here. I'll get off." My classmate pulled over, and the man opened the door and hopped out. "Thanks for getting my cousin there safely. I won't go with him into the crematorium," he said. Under the dim yellow streetlight, my classmate finally got a clear look at his face. Thick eyebrows, big eyes, a straight nose, and a square jaw. Aside from an unusually pale complexion, he'd be considered a real handsome guy in the countryside. "No problem, it's my job," my classmate replied. "Here's a little something for you. Please take it," the man said, pulling a stack of crisp bills from his pocket and handing over 10 100 yuan notes. "No, no, really I can't," my classmate protested. "If you don't take it, I'll be upset," the man said with a smile, his white teeth glinting under the light. Reluctantly, my classmate accepted the money and watched as the man disappeared down a side path. Not a bad haul tonight, he thought to himself, pleased. He drove the hearse straight to the crematorium, then went to the duty room to sleep. The next day, he slept until noon. After lunch, as he was about to head home, he ran into old Wang, a colleague who worked at the crematorium fixing up corpses' appearances. "Hey, Xiao Zhang," old Wang said with a grin. "That body you brought in yesterday was a tough one to fix. Took me over an hour. Died from pesticide, looked awful. But once I cleaned him up, he was pretty handsome. Bet a lot of girls are heartbroken over this one." Handsome? My classmate's mind flashed to the man from the night before, the one who'd claimed to be the deceased's cousin. "Take me to see him," he said. "What? You gonna find him a wife?" Old Wang chuckled, leading him to the cold storage room. He slid open a large drawer, revealing the body. Thick eyebrows, big eyes, straight nose, square jaw, and those unmistakable white teeth peeking through his lips. Even after the makeup, he was undeniably good-looking. But my classmate let out a scream and bolted out of there. Under the blazing sunlight, his face went pale, sweat pouring off him, his breathing nearly stopping. "What's wrong with you?" Old Wang asked, startled, chasing after him. "And nothing," my classmate stammered, steadying himself. He slipped his hand into his pocket, and his heart started pounding again. He pulled out 10 crisp bills, not yuan, but underworld money, the kind burned for the dead. Back home, he collapsed as if all strength had left him. He fell seriously ill, and after recovering, quit his job at the crematorium. From then on, he never dared drive at night again. And that's the story of the midnight hearse for you today.